Democracy and the state of emergency. Can democracy afford to have the possibility of the state of emergency in its constitutions? That is the question. This is the management of reality. Thank you for tuning us in, everybody. Let's see. We did talk about this already in the previous podcast. The basic idea is this. I'm going to be continuing the conversation, but I just want to sort of review what we talked about. So the basic idea is this. They tell us that they need a state of emergency provision in our democratic liberal constitutions because, goes the argument, when there is a big emergency, the state needs to be able to use all possible tools to protect us, and that may require trampling on our normal rights and liberties. So in a state of emergency, those rights and liberties are suspended. In other words, the Constitution is suspended, and you basically become a slave. The state can do whatever it wants. Okay. So hold on. Forgive me, I just realized I was not connected, and that was going to be a problem in a few minutes. So this is the official argument. You know, the bureaucrats say to us, we need to protect you. The politicians say to us, we need to protect you. And so we need the state of emergency provision so that we can act with full powers in an emergency. And that sounds good if you map onto the individual state relationship, the relationship that you have with a personal friend. So the metaphor I gave you guys was you're standing on the curb and your friend throws you to the ground because a passing bus was almost going to hit you, right? So he violated you, right? He didn't ask your permission, and he threw you to the ground, right? But the point is, he's trying to protect you. He's trying to save you from the passing bus, and if he stops to ask you instead of just throwing you down, then you'll die, right? So he had to violate you in order to protect you. And this is the intuition you're supposed to map onto the relationship between the individual and the state. There's a big emergency that is endangering the citizens, so the state violates the citizens. The state suspends ordinary rights and liberties in order to protect us. Okay? Now, the problem with mapping one situation to the other is that the state is not your friend. The bureaucrats running the state are abstractions to you. You don't know these people personally, and they don't know you. You're an abstraction to them, and they're an abstraction to you. So that's one key difference, right? You can't expect them to care about you the way your friend cares about you. Another difference, very important difference, is that you can see the concrete danger. You can see the bus. In the case of a quote-unquote national emergency, the danger is something that is interpreted for you. I mean, and even when you can see an actual danger, the magnitude of it and whether it rises to the constitutional threshold or to the threshold that in the Constitution would amount to, you know, it's sufficient for declaring a state of emergency. That's very ambiguous, and they get to make that determination, not you. And finally, when your friend saves you from the bus, he does not become all powerful. He doesn't enslave you. The state, on the other hand, when it declares a state of emergency and suspends your rights and freedoms, does become more powerful, and at the limit, it becomes all powerful, turning you into a slave. And we saw this in COVID, right? That we were treated like cattle. We were injected against our will with an experimental genetic therapy. We were confined in our homes. forced to wear masks and so forth. We were coerced. In other words, we were forced to behave in certain ways and to not behave in certain ways, and also we were medicated against our will. All right, and that's what happens with animals and with slaves. The justification was that there was an emergency, right? But we were trampled on. So the question is, can we afford this? Is it true that allowing our constitutions to, in other words, that allowing the possibility of declaring a state of emergency in our constitutions, is it true that that's better for us than the alternative? Is it true that the costs of not having a state of emergency provision are lower than the costs of having one? All right. Well, I think that the COVID crisis is already demonstration enough that the costs of having the state of emergency provision are much larger, because they wouldn't have been able to do that to us if, number one, we didn't have state of emergency provisions in our constitutions, and number two, we were brought up to interpret that anyone trying to declare a state of emergency is a usurper who's trying to enslave us, right? If that's sort of the conditioned response that we get from our education, from our civic education, in that world, they wouldn't be able to use an emergency to enslave us the way they did during COVID, okay? So that's the argument that I'm defending. Now, I want to, the other example I gave was Nazism, because Nazism produced the Second World War, and the declaration of a state of emergency was quite instrumental for the Nazis to acquire total power in Germany and begin to do everything that they did, right? So, can you think of something more costly than World War II, or more costly for humanity than COVID, that the state of emergency has saved us from? If you can, then we really have an argument here. But if you can't, I win, because nothing more costly has ever happened to humanity than World War II and COVID, right? So, and they're both costs that were imposed because we allow governments to declare a state of emergency. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to make clear that everything I'm saying is consistent with classical liberal theory. And classical liberal theory is now what we call libertarianism, because, or what we should always, I think, call libertarianism, because in the United States, unfortunately, the term liberalism and liberal have been transformed, and they are synonymous there with progressivism and almost Marxism, which is the opposite of liberalism, right? So it's had it's an Orwellian development. The term liberalism has become its opposite in the United States. So I like to always specify that I'm talking about classical liberalism, or what is now more commonly used as libertarianism, to refer to a position that is very skeptical of the state, that is always trying to reduce the state as much as possible, precisely because we don't want there to be the opportunity of coercing us, so that we can preserve our freedoms, okay? Our liberties, I should say, our rights and liberties. Okay. I wanna make the case that this idea that the state of emergency is very dangerous and at the limit completely destructive of democracy, and therefore we can't tolerate it. That idea, that basic idea that I'm selling, is actually perfectly consistent with what our major theorists in the history of classical liberalism have said. So let me now point out what they have said, and I will draw out the logical implications. Okay. So first we have Spinoza. Spinoza because Baruch Spinoza is the philosopher that launches the Enlightenment. Okay? He's the great founding father of the European Enlightenment, and therefore the founding father of modern Western classical liberalism. Okay? Spinoza is writing in the 17th century. Okay, so that's kind of a long time ago. And yet, already in Spinoza, you find in its mature form all of the ideas that we consider fundamental for modern Western liberal democracy, right? So, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, universal suffrage, et cetera, whatnot. It's all in there. On the question of structure, forgive me, I didn't say what work. This is Theological Political Tractatus, or treatise. On the question of structure, Spinoza recommended one, an executive subject to the law; two, a division of powers with respect to interpretation and implementation of the law; and three, a separation of religious and civil authority. Okay? So none of that is original with the Baron de Montesquieu, who is usually sort of identified as the locus classicus of separation of powers and balance of forces to preserve democracy. I don't want to take any merit away from Montesquieu, but it's just this stuff is not original with him. It's all in Spinoza, and so you have Spinoza to thank for the Enlightenment and for modern democracy, and you also have Spinoza, but Spinoza is actually deriving all of this from the Bible, and he has a very erudite discussion where he shows how all of the principles of modern democracy that he's defending are actually defended in the Hebrew Bible. So you have the Hebrew Bible to thank for the Enlightenment and modern democracy. Now, here is what Spinoza wrote more specifically on the question that I'm considering. He says, quote, "No one can ever so utterly transfer to another his power and consequently his rights as to cease to be a man, nor can there ever be a power so sovereign that it can carry out every possible wish, for it would then be possible to maintain with impunity the most violent tyranny, which, I suppose, no one would for an instant admit." End of quote. This lengthy circumlocution, this beating around the bush, is as close as Spinoza could come in the 1600s, even in the comparatively liberal Netherlands, to say that if the people is trampled upon, they have a right to revolt, And Spinoza was careful to say that the protection argument was a lie. Okay? And I quote him: "Those who administer or possess governing power always try to surround their high-handed actions with a cloak of legality and to persuade the people that they act from good motives. This they are easily able to effect when they are the sole interpreters of the law, for it is evident that they are thus able to assume a far greater freedom to carry out their wishes and desires." Unquote. They're always trying to cloak their actions in good motives. I'm going to protect you. I have to declare a state of emergency. I have to suspend your rights and freedom. Why? To protect you, right? They always cloak it in good motives. But what do they want? What is it that they're after? They're trying to become the sole interpreters of the law. They're trying to acquire total power, which is what happens when you accept a protection argument for the declaration of a state of emergency. So Western liberalism was actually born with this claim: you may revolt against the elite promise of protection because they're just manipulating you to seize more power. That's what Spinoza is saying. Now, of course, Spinoza hit everybody right in the gut, or at least the aristocrats right in the gut. who were reading his book, because those aristocrats, they were feudal aristocrats, and therefore they believed that they had a number of rights by which to oppress the commoners. Okay? And what gave them the right to oppress the commoners in this feudal ideology was precisely that they were supposedly giving protection to the commoners. That was the actual official argument of the that was the feudal social contract. Okay, I get to oppress you because I'm protecting you militarily, and so I'm going to steal your product and treat you, like almost like a beast. Why? Because I'm protecting you militarily. That was the social contract, and it was quite explicit, right? And Spinoza is saying it's a fraud. That's what he's saying. The protection argument, the good motives, etc. It's just a ploy to get more, to justify their power, to justify the oppression. Okay. Now, if you're thinking that Baruch Spinoza was very brave, you're 100% correct. And he was also very, very smart. Obviously, he's the father of the Enlightenment. He's one of the great geniuses of all our history. So, of course, he published theological political treatises anonymously in 1670 with false publisher information and a disguised place of publication, because he knew what was going to happen. The minute he published this book, it was quickly denounced all over Europe, and in several places it was banned. Okay, but Spinoza was deriving his arguments from the Bible in a civilization that took the Bible seriously. So people were actually confronted by what he wrote, and it turns out that no matter that they denounced him, and no matter that in some places his work was banned, still people began reading him a lot, and he became very, very influential with the aristocrats even. So I'm going to give you a quote here from James Carroll's book called, the title is The Church and the Jews. It's a very interesting book. And what James Carroll writes here, he says, quote, "In the years immediately following Spinoza's death, an incubation period of modernity, Spinoza's influence was widely felt. His ideas, Leibniz said in 1704, were, quote, stealing gradually into the minds of men of high station who rule the rest and on whom affairs depend, and slithering into fashionable books are inclining everything towards the universal revolution with which Europe is threatened." End of quote. So this Leibniz, he was not happy about this. And what he's describing is, of course, what we now call a viral process, right? He's describing a process where the fact that they had a printing press now, and that information could spread a lot more quickly now, produced something like a viral process, right? Obviously slower than the ones we see today, but sufficiently quick to scare the hell out of Leibniz, who was a political reactionary. And Leibniz was very worried that Spinoza's work was going to produce a universal revolution, as he said, and that's exactly what it did. The French Revolution happened about 85 years after Leibniz wrote those words. Now, why was Leibniz so worried? Because he was a political reactionary, right? He was a baron of the Holy Roman Empire, and he didn't like the idea of giving power to the people, right? But notice what he's saying. He's saying that Spinoza is becoming a viral author among the men of, quote, the men of high station who rule the rest and on whom affairs depend, unquote. Okay? So Spinoza is changing the minds of the people who have political power, and that threatens to upset the apple cart. Now, so that's Spinoza. Now, when a little bit after Spinoza dies, precisely during this period where everybody's reading Spinoza right after his death, John Locke, the great British liberal, fled his country to the Netherlands. Okay, he takes refuge in the Netherlands because of the Rye House plot. I'm not going to get into that, but there was a controversy. He flees, and well, of course, in the Netherlands, at a time when everybody was reading Spinoza, he was obviously very influenced by Spinoza. And you can find the same kind of argument, but even more extreme in Locke, because Locke wrote, quote, "Wherever law ends, tyranny begins," unquote. So the argument he develops is that if a constituted authority violates the law on any point, then on that point the citizen may legitimately resist. Well, the state of emergency amounts to an abrogation of all law. So by Locke's own definition, it is the greatest tyranny and hence legitimates a general citizen revolt. In 1850, a century and a half after Locke passed away, the great French liberal Frédéric Bastiat took the argument even further. He argued that even a lawful, quote-unquote, liberal order operating normally can be tyrannical, and that the liberal constitution of the French Second Republic that Louis Napoleon Bonaparte presided had already betrayed the citizens. Okay. So this is the French Second Republic established after the revolutions of 1848. Okay, these are the European Spring, they call it. It's when all of the peoples of Europe rose in revolution simultaneously the same year, 1848, and scared the hell out of the aristocrats, right? What happened in France after these revolutions is that they founded the Second French Republic, and they instituted universal male suffrage for the first time in history. And the French elected Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte, to be the president of the French Second Republic. And Frédéric Bastiat, a great classical liberal, we would call him a libertarian today, he was convinced that this had already been ruined. The entire idea of democracy had already been ruined. And I'm going to quote him. He says, quote, "Law has destroyed its own object. It has been employed in annihilating that justice which it ought to have established, in effacing amongst rights that limit which it was its true mission to respect. It has placed the collective force, that is to say, the monopoly of force, in the service of those who wish to traffic without risk and without scruple in the persons, the liberty, and the property of others. It has converted plunder into a right that it may protect it, and lawful defense into a crime that it may punish it." End of quote. So according to Bastiat, the way the law had been structured in the French Second Republic was not very liberal at all. And it was designed to make certain kinds of oppression legal, right? Well, a state of emergency only makes all of that worse. For whatever constitutional protections remain for ordinary citizens, even though Bastiat thinks that there are not very many, but whatever remains, that disappears completely in a state of emergency, and Bastiat would only have more objections in that case. A few years later, in 1864, the great liberal political theorist Maurice Joly, who is very dear to the management of reality because he is the first great theorist of the management of reality. I'm going to put up the article we have about him here so that you can see it. If you want to go read about him, it's really worth it. So I don't know why I can't see it here. Let's see. There it is. So this is our article on Maurice Joly and the theory of counterfeit democracy. Okay. And this Maurice Joly is the first great theorist of the management of reality. I'll tell you in a second why. So he's also writing in the French Second Republic, just like Bastiat, but he's writing a little bit later in 1864. And he accused that Louis Napoleon was using his secret police to manufacture sham conspiracies, quote unquote, against his own government. Why? To arouse the sympathy of the people and to justify his own policies of repression. Okay. Joly, how does Joly explain this? He creates a philosophical dialogue between Montesquieu and Machiavelli. And in this dialogue, Montesquieu and Machiavelli are both dead. They're, bored in hell, waiting for the final judgment. So they pass the time by chatting about political theory and so forth. And Montesquieu tells Machiavelli, he says, look, after you died, it all got better, and people listened to me, and they created this, divided government and Republican government, blah, blah, blah. And now freedom is assured because the institutions have been properly designed, and there's a checks and balances like I recommended, and so forth. And Machiavelli looks at him with pity, and he says, you don't understand anything. And the rest of the book, it's Machiavelli making fun of Montesquieu, explaining to him how, even though, quote unquote, democracy has been created, it's all for naught because the citizenry has allowed the government to create a clandestine service that can spend the money of the citizens in secret, and therefore the bureaucrats are just going to corrupt the entire system, right? So it'll look like a democracy, but in the secret police will have all of the reins of the different institutions clandestinely under its control. And one of the things that Machiavelli explains to Montesquieu is that the prince, as he calls the democratic leader, he says that the prince is going to be creating these sham conspiracies. In other words, he's going to use the clandestine service to produce the danger that will then allow him to suspend rights and liberties, to declare a state of emergency. Although Joly does not use that term, but this is what he says. He says that Louis Napoleon, forgive me, he never mentions Louis Napoleon because he was trying to be clever, just like Spinoza, and avoid being discovered as the author of his own book, right? So he never mentions Louis Napoleon by name. So the text is always talking about the prince. And Machiavelli explains that the prince is going to manufacture, with his clandestine service, sham conspiracies against his own government. He says the prince has, quote, control over the various revolutionary elements in the country. And so if there is a commotion somewhere, it is my hand that sets it going. If a plot is hatched, I, the prince, am the instigator. I am the head conspirator, end of quote. And by such ruses, quote, the public can be intimidated, and the prince can, if need be, procure the harsh measures he wants or put into effect those already at hand, end of quote. He's talking about a state of emergency. What Maurice Joly is explaining is that if you allow a state of emergency provision in your constitution, and you allow the bureaucrats to have a clandestine service, that spends your money in secret, well, they're going to use that clandestine service to manufacture a sham danger that will then become the excuse for what he calls the harsh measures, quote unquote, for the state of emergency, for suspending citizen rights and liberties. Okay? In the 20th century, the great free market economist of the libertarian Austrian school, Friedrich Hayek, wrote in his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, that, quote, central planning leads to dictatorship because dictatorship is the most effective instrument of coercion in the enforcement of ideals. And as such, it is essential if central planning on a large scale is to be possible, end of quote. In other words, Hayek is saying, if bureaucrats are given central planning powers, dictatorship follows. Because the more you concentrate power, the greater the abuse, right? This is the famous aphorism of Lord Acton's that is famous because it resonates. We know it's true. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So if you give bureaucrats central planning powers, you're making them immensely powerful. Therefore, you are going to corrupt them completely. And they're going to try to become a dictatorship because that's what corrupt rulers do, right? Now, no greater concentration of power can exist in a liberal democratic order than when a state of emergency is declared. Right? Now, Hayek is not speaking about state of emergency specifically. He's worried about communism, socialism. And communism, as noted in the previous podcast, is a kind of a full power state of emergency. Okay? Why? Because all power is concentrated in the state in communism, which is exactly what happens in a state of emergency, right? Or you could say that the state of emergency is compressed communism. Okay? You can look at it either way. So following Hayek's own logic, he's worried about communism. Well, he should be equally afraid of the state of emergency, right? It follows from his own argument. Another classical liberal who worries about the growth of government is Robert Higgs. He says that in the United States, quote, each genuine crisis has been the occasion for another ratchet toward bigger government, end of quote. It is, he says, quote, the progressive ideological imperative that government must do something, must take responsibility for resolving any perceived crisis, unquote, that underwrites this, right? So the argument for making the government more powerful in the history of the United States, and he reviews that history, is always, well, we have a crisis. And who has to solve the crisis? The government. And how is the government going to solve the crisis? We have to give it more power. Okay? And this has been going on decade after decade. And with each crisis, the government has gotten bigger because the powers acquired in a crisis are never returned. Okay? They're never relinquished. Which reminds me of George Orwell, because George Orwell, in 1984, he says, and I quote, "We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship." End of quote. So if we transpose that to our topic, we'd be saying something like, one does not suspend rights and liberties to solve an emergency. One leans on the emergency, or on the alleged emergency, to suspend rights and liberties. Bureaucrats never let a crisis go to waste, right? And a crisis so serious that citizens allow a suspension of the Constitution, birthing a maximal big government, well, that's just the limiting case of the ratchet effect that worries Robert Higgs so much, right? So once again, if Robert Higgs doesn't like the fact that crises produce ever bigger government that never relinquishes the powers acquired, then he should be maximally worried about the power that the government has to declare a state of emergency. Then we have Murray Rothbard, who's the great continuator of the libertarian Austrian School of Economics. And he writes in War, Peace, and the State that, quote, domestic tyranny is the inevitable accompaniment of war. The great Randolph Bourne realized that, quote, war is the health of the state, unquote. It is in war that the state really comes into its own, swelling in power, in number, in pride, in absolute dominion over the economy and the society. In war, the state frantically mobilizes the people to fight for it against another state, under the pretext that it is fighting for the people. Some wars may be just, truly fought in self-defense. I won't deny that. But bureaucrats may seek a war in order to produce the perfect emergency that will call them forth as protectors, thus augmenting their tyrannical powers to the limit. And I'm sure that's the reason that the US Constitution, at least formally, vests the exclusive power to declare war not in the president, but in Congress. Of course, in our actual history, this never happens. I mean, presidents just go to war whenever they want. But let us just say that technically there was an effort to make sure that presidents couldn't declare war in order to try to protect us from that particular problem that Rothbard is talking about, right? And we can consider also this philosopher, Italian philosopher, Giorgio Agamben. Now, he's not a classical liberal. He comes from a Marxist background, but paradoxically, this really is a paradox. He converges with classical liberals in this profound suspicion that he has of emergency power and concentrated sovereignty, which for a Marxist, it's just very weird. It's paradoxical. But anyway, Agamben stands on Schmidt's shoulders. Remember on the last podcast, I explained that Carl Schmitt, the great political theorist Carl Schmitt, he defines sovereignty as whoever gets to decide on the state of emergency. Okay, so for him, the state of emergency is the fundamental concept for locating where sovereignty lies. Okay, so whoever can decide that a state of emergency is going to be declared says that's the true sovereign, says Carl Schmitt. And I think Schmitt is right, and I defended that view in the previous podcast. But anyway, Agamben stands on Schmitt's shoulders to argue in his work State of Exception that historically the state of emergency has been a powerful strategy to make democracies slide into totalitarian states. I quote him. He says, "The voluntary creation of a permanent state of emergency, though perhaps not declared in the technical sense, has become one of the essential practices of contemporary states, including so-called democratic ones. The state of exception tends increasingly to appear as the dominant paradigm of government in contemporary politics. The state of exception appears as a threshold of indeterminacy between democracy and absolutism," end of quote. Now, in the COVID crisis, he's a big critic of everything that happened in the COVID crisis. And he accuses that there was there an obvious tendency, which he considers a general tendency, quote, "to use a state of exception as a normal paradigm for government," end of quote. And, he really does have a point. I mean, in the COVID crisis, their emergency measures were described to us officially as the new normal. This is the term they used. This is the new normal. That's exactly what Agamben is saying. They're trying to make the state of emergency a normal paradigm. You're just going to exist now in a state of emergency, you see, because then they can suspend your rights and liberties permanently. And I do think that Agamben is right, that bureaucrats always trend in this direction because they want more power. Bureaucrats or whoever controls the bureaucrats, the answer is going to be the same. So let's not worry about that nuance. Okay, so what's coming, right? So that's, I made my pitch. I think that the state of emergency is consistent with what our greatest liberal thinkers have said. I mean, the state of emergency is a danger to democracy, right? That idea is consistent with what our greatest liberal thinkers have said. That's the reason I don't want the state of emergency on the books. I don't want it to be a provision in our constitutions. And I think that if the West survives the present crisis that we're in, if we come out on the other side still democratic, still Judeo-Christian, anchored in Judeo-Christian values, the values that produced modern democratic civilization, then in our new constitutions, in our rewritten constitutions, we should forbid the state of emergency. And I had a proposed article that I read in the previous podcast. I'm going to read it again. I think it's worth it. It says this. I lost it. Here it is. Article 1. I'd like it to be the first article or the second article of our new constitutions, because that would help give it the right kind of salience, okay, to impress on people just how important this is. Article 1, under no circumstances will any institution of this republic be allowed to declare a state of emergency that suspends the constitutional rights and liberties of the citizens. Any attempt to do so, for whatever reason, must be interpreted by the citizenry as a threat to the basic democratic survival of the republic. If a grave danger is perceived, state bureaucrats are allowed to inform, recommend, and cajole the citizenry, and they may employ the powers already granted to mitigate the danger. But no institution of the republic may, for any reason, including, or perhaps especially, a claim to be, quote unquote, protecting the citizenry, suspend the constitutional rights of the citizens. For those state bureaucrats without emergency powers will find it more difficult to respond to some dangers, they will also find it more difficult to extinguish citizen rights and liberties, and no greater danger exists than the loss of liberty itself. Okay, that would be my proposed constitutional article to forbid any kind of possibility of declaring a state of emergency. Okay, now, what happens now? Where's this going? Where's the system going? I think a civil war is a made-to-order crisis for power-hungry bureaucrats. It's sort of the ideal case. So if the country internally descends into chaos, into warring factions that are violently at each other's throats, well then, we've given the government the excuse to declare a state of emergency. It's a golden excuse. It doesn't get better than that, right? And it seems to me, and what follows from that is totalitarianism, of course. And it seems to me that Western civilization everywhere has long been trending in the direction of civil war. And the result of this trend, if unchecked, will of course be totalitarian tyranny. Now, there are two main reasons for the impending civil wars. The first is that the identity politics of the woke left has been it has completely balkanized society. Okay. And the second is that untold numbers of Muslims have immigrated to the West. Neither trend is organic. Both are deliberate Machiavellian policies of the Western bosses, or so says the Moore model. Okay, so let me just summarize these two processes and then I will conclude my analysis. Now, I'll be the first to recognize that the suffering imposed on the working classes by cruel crony capitalists during the Industrial Revolution largely made the argument for the revolutionary socialists, right? I mean, people really were hurting during the Industrial Revolution, and the big monopolists really were bastards, and they were oppressing ordinary workers. All of that was happening, and it made socialism seem appealing to a lot of people because it was difficult for people to realize that if they went for socialism, they would be oppressed just the same, because they would be concentrating all power in the government, right? So so this was going on. I'm not going to deny it, and when the workers tried to organize to defend themselves, the industrial bosses would interpret that as a kind of a slave revolt, right? And actually, if you look at the history of the United States, I know that they don't teach people this, but there's no controversy over whether this happened. This is famous among historians. But if you look at the second half of the 19th century in the United States and the early days of the 20th century, before World War I, you had a kind of civil war between workers and bosses going on in the United States. It was a tremendous thing. Very, very bloody. Workers trying to organize strikes, demand basic humane working conditions. And the bosses responding to this by hiring gunmen to fire on the workers. And then the workers fire back, and entire towns burned. And this went on for decades. It was a tremendous thing, and they don't teach it anymore. You can get an education about the United States without practically hearing anything about this. But it was going on, okay? And when you consider why socialism has been appealing, I think this genesis needs to be understood. And I have written about these processes. So, for example, if you wanna go read about this, I have a series called "Are the Western Bosses Psychopaths?" Which we're going to have it in the description. And I look into that history because it's important to know it, and it's important to understand how that history not only produced the workers' movements that resisted the oppression, but also the strategies of the industrial bosses, which initially was just naked repression, and then it mutated into eugenics, which produced German Nazism. So that line has to be understood. Anyway, the forces of change proved too powerful even for these industrial bosses, at least in the medium term. And so they were, in some senses, they were humiliated. They had to order their political retainers to get on board with a more humane form of capitalism. And I think the threat of Marxist revolution played a role in that. I don't think we should forget that either, right? And it was not a change of heart at the top. I mean, the system was reformed because they were afraid that they were going to lose it. It was hypocrisy. But there is no denying that the system did change and Western capitalism was reformed. And as a result, after World War II, worker resentment of the rich largely died. It's coming back recently, of course, but for a good while, the resentment that the poor felt towards the ultra rich pretty much disappeared because after World War II, with all of these reforms and with the economic growth and the operation of free markets, people got, even the workers got a lot wealthier, right? So that kind of social conflict subsided, and it kind of put Marxist professors in the universities in a difficult position, because now what was their Marxism for? I mean, if the workers didn't want revolution, if they were not unhappy with modern capitalism anymore, then what did you need a Marxist professor for, right? They risked being cast adrift into meaninglessness unless they could reinvent somehow social conflict. They needed to find new victims to defend from oppression. And if such victims didn't exist, they would invent them. And that's how these uh, professors, these Marxist professors, became cultural Marxists. Okay, they ventured beyond economic questions to reinterpret every social cleavage under the sun as a battleground between oppressors and their victims. Identified now not by behavior, but by category membership. Okay, it's a very interesting move. And crucial. So male, female, white, black, Western, non-Western, heterosexual versus LGBT, etc. Handsome versus ugly, thin versus fat, smart versus stupid. Every distinction became redefined and then split again, and then intersectionally micro redefined and split again as an oppressor victim binary. And this was a radical inversion for Marxists, because originally Marxism was claiming that they were going to emancipate us from traditional essentialized categories, and they would join all the workers in fraternal solidarity. No? But now these cultural Marxists were completely conquered by racism. So now the basis of the left now is racism. So you're a bad guy if you're white. You're a bad guy if you're heterosexual. This is how they talk. So your behaviors no longer define how you're morally evaluated. Your category membership does, and they're constantly pitting people against each other. They want people fighting. They want women to feel oppressed by men. They want blacks to feel oppressed by whites. They want gays to feel oppressed by straight people, and so forth. They're constantly drumming this alleged oppression, right? And this is what we call identity politics. They created that. Of course, they call themselves, in grand Orwellian style, they call themselves anti-racists, but the basis of all their thought now on the left is racism. So in this manner, social conflict was reinvented. Now, these new left Marxist professors who became dominant in the social sciences and humanities, well, they have a great cultural opportunity because they have tremendous prestige, right? The students come in, the university students come in, their professors are like gods to them. And what they're dishing out in the social sciences and humanities is this woke new left cultural Marxism. And so that's what they learn. There's been decades of this. And so what they're learning, what these kids have been learning decade after decade, is that there's no higher morality than extracting a vengeful chunk of flesh and a humiliating apology from whoever you've identified as your oppressor. And they're going to have to apologize publicly and humiliatingly, but it's only going to get them a temporary reprieve. Okay, that's sort of the grammar of the woke left. There's never any final redemption. And people quickly pick up the logic of this grammar, of this political grammar. So they quickly realize that the only way to stay briefly ahead of a possible attack from the new multitude of victims is to rush to identify yourself as some category of victim, right? Which you can't establish except via some loud action to extract some public contrition from whomever you've designated as your oppressor, thus demonstrating by the cowed apologies that you extract that you are indeed some kind of victim, right? And that's how you try to stay safe from the attacks from leftists. But it never works. Sooner or later, they're going to get you. And that's exactly what I'm driving to, because if sooner or later everybody's going to be under the gun, and the cultural Marxist process that has been polluting the minds of university students forces everybody into antagonistic categories and splits them more and more, well, sooner or later, you're going to have violent conflict in the streets. And we've been seeing this. It's begun. It began with BLM in 2020, right? And it's only going to get worse, especially because the woke grammar pits by race all whites against all non-whites. I mean, we're going to have some kind of race war if this keeps going on. And isn't that what the Nazis wanted? That's exactly what the Nazis wanted. They wanted a race war. That's the extreme right wing, right? Well, now the same project seems to be lodged in the left wing. It's the woke leftists who are itching for this race fight now. It's really remarkable. And it's all top down. You have to understand this. It's all top down because the people who control the universities are the great industrialists. The most powerful people in the world are the people who control the universities. They've been hiring these cultural Marxists on purpose. They want us divided. They want us fighting each other. They want us to become racist who can't see another individual human being and can only see that human's category as a, and they can only see it as a reason to hate them. That's what they want, because you divide and you rule. It's the oldest rule of politics. Okay, so once the civil wars begin in earnest, they'll get to declare a state of emergency, and then they will impose totalitarianism on us. Divide and rule. And you can say the same for the importation of Muslims, right? It's been policy, loud policy. I mean, Angela Merkel in Germany during the height of the Syrian civil war, she publicly said, look, we're going to receive them. We'll receive all the refugees. There will be no ceiling. I think something like 1 million Muslims came into Germany at this time. And they're really regretting it now, because a lot of these Muslims are radical Muslims. They're what we call jihadis. And the ones that didn't come in as radical Muslims get radicalized in Europe, because the mosques that have been built all over Europe, again, this is a policy of the Western bosses. They've allowed the jihadi states, the Sharia states, like Kuwait, Qatar, Turkey, even Iran, Saudi Arabia, of course, to finance the construction of mosques all over Europe. And of course, if these states are constructing mosques in Europe, well, they're staffed by radical clerics who, I shouldn't say radical, I should just say Orthodox, by Orthodox Muslim clerics who preach jihad, which is a central concept in Orthodox Islam, and therefore the destruction of the West. So that's going to produce a civil war. It's already starting. You can already see it in Europe, right? And that's going to give them the excuse to declare a state of emergency. And guess what they're going to impose? They've been protecting Islam, right? We've seen this. It's very clear, for example, in Britain, where the authorities were protecting these Muslim rape gangs that were going on around raping. I think the figure is now in the thousands of British white girls. So this is coming to a head. They've engineered this. They've carefully constructed the conditions for civil war to erupt all over the West. And when it does, they will declare a state of emergency, and they will impose totalitarianism. You need to see this coming if you want to do something about it. Thank you for joining us. I'll see you next Thursday. And those of you who are paid subscribers on Substack, I'll see you in a second in the Q&A. If you're not a paid subscriber on Substack and you would like to be one, go to Francisco Gil White on Substack and become a paid subscriber, and we will welcome you at the question and answer sessions, where we always have a lot of fun getting into the weeds with all of these